Okay, let's get started. So, benvinguts, buenos dias, good morning. My name's Oliver Gower. Delighted to be here and to kick off one of the first sessions here at the Cybersecurity Congress, and thank you for coming. So I wanted to start with something topical on this theme of geopolitics and cybersecurity and how the two are linking together and the effect, the connection between conversations right at the top level of governments and in secret rooms in Washington or Beijing or Moscow are impacting local businesses and medium and large businesses here in Spain. So I wanted to start with something topical because I was reading recently that the Vatican actually now have a team of 90 Vatican vigilantes, cyber vigilantes across the globe who are working to protect the Vatican from cyber attacks. And no wonder, because there's evidence of Chinese-sponsored hacks of Vatican Catholic Church servers. There was the Vatican website that went dark after criticism of the invasion of Ukraine, and various other instances that should be raising concern. And in the United Nations annual assessment of cybersecurity in different countries, the Vatican was absolutely kind of rock bottom alongside countries like Azerbaijan, for example. 0 out of 20 it scored. So given, some of the concerns or some of the threats globally and some of the geopolitics linked to perhaps some of the tweets that the new Pope has previously put out, it would probably be wise to increase cybersecurity in the Vatican going forward. And it's probably not the last time we'll hear the Pope and cybersecurity mentioned in the same sentence. So I wanted to talk to you today about exactly this, about geopolitics and cybersecurity. So my name's Oliver Gower. I was the head of the National Cybercrime Unit in the UK, leading the UK's fight against organised cybercrime and threats from nation states. I was then the head of the Santander, Banco Santander's global cybersecurity team, leading the response to incidents and cyber attacks against Banco Santander here in Madrid. And I'm now the partner, the senior managing director for cybersecurity at FTI Consulting. And actually, which I'll give you some information on in a second, it's actually 8 years to the day almost. It was actually 8 years yesterday that WannaCry happened. Which was, for me, was something which kind of changed my life. It affected a lot of people's lives because I was leading the UK policing response to that attack. And that was an attack which was attributed by the governments to North Korea, and really is one of the first examples of this overlap between nation states and organized criminals. This was a nation state, allegedly, North Korea, using cybercrime to generate funds to circumvent sanctions, and in fact using a tool created by the Department of Defense in the US, which they adapted. So this is an early example of what we're going to talk about a bit more today. So FTI, if you're not aware, FTI, we are a consulting firm of 8,000 people in 34 countries. We're the leading firm for crisis response and transformation. So when experiencing a dramatic crisis or change, businesses come to us and we have the experts, the practitioners, to advise and provide the technical support, always with a focus on the technical delivery, to help companies progress through that change and evolve and transform. And I'll come back to give you more information about what we do and why it's different. So first of all, I wanted to talk about what we're seeing in terms of attacks on Spain, because I think it is something unique, something different, and it's a genuine challenge, and we want to get into some of the detail on that. So what are we seeing? Well, about 2 weeks ago, we weren't seeing very much. So I wanted to share this because it's a picture I took in Sitges 2 weeks ago in Catalonia, and I think it's nice. But also, it was the night of the Apagón. I'm not announcing that the Apagón had a cybersecurity aspect to it, although the Financial Times today is reporting that INCIBE is doing a lot of investigations into the local substations supporting renewable energy here in Spain. I think It's probably unlikely to have been a cybersecurity cause because of the way it manifested. However, what it highlights, and I'm sure I'm not the first person, I won't be the last person to reference the Apagon in this event, it highlights the importance of operational resilience, that whether it's an IT incident, a non-malicious error, or a cyber attack, resilience and ICT resilience is fundamental because of the world we live in, the interconnected nature of and digitalized nature of everything we do, and the overlapping nature of our supply chains. If you don't have a plan for when an incident happens, you're going to be in trouble. And that applies to countries, just as it does to airports like Heathrow Airport in March, or to the train network in Spain a couple of weeks ago. So in terms of numbers, pure numbers, Spain is under a kind of cyber siege. So we're seeing around 2,000 attacks a day. Ransomware's increased 120%, and it's now the 8th most targeted country in the world. It's one of the top, well, the 3rd most targeted country in terms of Russian or pro-Russian hacktivist attacks, and 87% of global detections of advanced malware. So we are seeing something different and unique in Spain that particularly affects Spain because 99% of businesses here are PYMEs, are small and medium-sized enterprises. So for that reason, Spain is suffering. But let's get into kind of why that is. The impact of it on medium and small businesses can be absolutely existential. So this is an example of a UK business. It was one of the largest logistics companies in the UK. Suffered a ransomware attack. Akira was put on their list in June last year and was wiped out. The company was unable to secure funds, 730 people made redundant. These attacks aren't just an annoyance, they are an existential threat to businesses and to the economy. And then we see it in bigger businesses. We've seen it in every sector in Spain, and very often with these nation-state links. Whether you're talking about Orange and Telefonica, who suffered attacks earlier this year, that was linked to Hellcat, with links to the Palestinian cause. Whether energy, Iberdrola, for example, Endesa, they were linked to a Russian or a Russian-linked organized crime group. Corte Inglés, we've seen lots of attacks against retail this year, not to mention Marks and Spencer's in the UK, one of the big retail outlets, announced today that personal data was included in the big hack that they've suffered. Here in Spain, Corte Inglés, this new group, Hunters International, which seems to have links between Russia and Nigeria. So we're seeing an evolution, and that's not to mention attacks from nation states on the public sector in Spain, the wave of attacks that I helped to respond to that affected the financial sector when I was in Banco Santander and affected also Bank of Spain. So everywhere we're seeing these links to nation states. What, in terms of the attacks that Spain is suffering? So what is the context at a macro level that's affecting and impacting small and medium-sized business in Spain? There's a few factors. So firstly, you may have seen the US administration announced a couple of months ago that they were pausing the offensive operations against Russian-sponsored cybercrime. So I used to work, as I said, in the National Crime Agency, and I know that traditional methods of disrupting cybercriminals are insufficient for having a lasting impact on cybercrime. These people often are based in Eastern Europe, Moldova, Ukraine, Russia. Not saying they're all sponsored by those governments, but they're based often in those places. Very hard to reach for arresting people. So you have to have a full spectrum response, as we called it in the British government, a holistic response that considers every possible tool at your disposal to deal with this threat, from arresting people to sanctions, financial sanctions, to disrupting people's travel, to misinformation, to undercover policing in online forums, the whole gamut of to hacking back and offensive operations. You have to deliver a holistic response to have any hope of reducing the threat. That depends on collaboration between governments, collaboration between the EU and the US, which clearly is under some strain at the moment. It depends on information sharing. It depends on having a clear definition of who we're talking about, who are these criminals, what are their nicknames, who are the key marketplace enablers that we need to target. And stopping those offensive attacks potentially creates more capacity for Russian-sponsored groups to target countries or to target businesses in Europe. We're seeing it in terms of how they're targeting countries. So, the hybrid warfare that Russia has launched against Ukraine, combining kinetic and cyber elements in these examples, is very evident. The Russian-sponsored or pro-Russian attacks I mentioned already on Spanish banking sector, the Bank of Spain, for example, these are all ways in which the Russian or organized crime groups in a permissive environment within or near to Russia are going to have more capacity to launch these kinds of attacks because they're not having to defend or mitigate offensive attacks from the US. This is something we can suppose is the case. Secondly, the fragmented marketplace. So the criminal marketplace has evolved over the past 15 years or so quite dramatically. You'll have heard people say how it's a business. There's someone for every service. There's a code of practice. There's advertising. There's contracts. There's everything. What's changed significantly is that this used to be 5 or 6 main groups. We knew who they were. We knew how they operated, more or less. And in that sense, you could gather intelligence, you could mitigate, you could predict TTPs, you could prevent. It's partly due to disruption by law enforcement. I'm not going to overstate that. I was part of that. I think that has had some impact, but it's always limited, and it's hard to know to what extent groups then shift into a new form rather than being completely dismantled. But partly because of that, and partly because of the war in Ukraine. We're talking about criminals who were based perhaps in Ukraine, Russians, or in Moldova, and then the war happens and suddenly they're on opposing sides. That's driven a fragmentation, a splintering in how these groups operate. What this has meant is that the barrier, with the marketplace as it is and with the fragmentation, the barrier to entry into cybercrime has come right down. The specialization of these individual groups has increased. Their resilience has increased because there's more of them. There's more of them to step in to fill the void when one of them gets taken down. They're harder to predict because they're less centralized and the picture is less clear. I mean, it literally is the case of sitting in a room. I've done this, sitting in the room with government agencies from the Five Eyes groups, from the US, from Canada, and trying to map out the criminal marketplace and compare and contrast the individuals that you think are key targets for disrupting cybercrime. If you're now talking about 20 groups instead of 5, if you're talking about 100 different nicknames for an attacker instead of 10, it becomes very, very difficult. And then add in the strain, the geopolitics, which is putting a strain on those relations. So to give you an illustration, and actually today, or this month, is the 10-year birthday of Tox, which was one of the first ransomware as a service groups. But this is how it was 10 years ago. Then we're seeing, through a combination of disruption or just disbandment of these groups, we're seeing the evolution through the last few years. And as we go, you'll see some of the more familiar names. Actually, Clop, which you can see in the first column, Clop has been around for ages, but it only really got famous when the Move It attack happened. But as we go through, we see how these groups evolve. We see some more recognizable names, Medusa, Blackbuster. And then as we move into the last couple of years, the groups start to multiply. So we're seeing more and more groups, and really this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are a large volume of these groups forming with different tactics and techniques, and it's very hard to mitigate. Some law enforcement activity has taken these out, but as you can see, they then evolve into something new. Unless you can arrest these people, it's very difficult to completely put a stop to them. So the third factor I'd bring in is collaboration between criminal groups and nation states. So there's an alliance between these two causes. Their tactics, their techniques are the same. Their goals slightly different, but kind of complementary, as we'll see. And criminals benefit from being, if not funded by nation states, sometimes they are, at least given a permissive environment in which Russian-speaking criminals, for example, are allowed to launch their attacks as long as within the code they're not able to hit Russian domains. So Russia, and other nation states are potentially outsourcing cyber espionage. Why are they doing that? As I said, because there's an overlap between the objectives. Criminals want to make money, that's what they do. They're focused on extortion, fraud, but actually nation states increasingly want to make money as well through cybercrime, and the norms of behavior are changing. So generating funds through the means of crime, potentially more acceptable within a nation state's playbook now. If you apply sanctions to North Korea, it's well documented that generating funds through cyber attacks is one of the best approaches. So you've got an overlap in terms of the financial objective. You've then got the objective of information theft. For criminals, the data is valuable. For nation states, it also enables them to, it funds and drives their cyber espionage campaigns, because with that information, they're able to then feed that through into human operations, traditional spy operations, and create insiders and create access to organizations through the data that the criminals are able to harvest. So fine, you go ahead and do that. You sell that information or extort someone and generate funds, pass me the data, I'll use it to drive my operations. And by the way, while you do it, please leave me a back door to this infrastructure that I could exploit in a future scenario, maybe a future war scenario. So there's a real synergy between their motivations. Obviously, driving all of this, it'd be remiss of me not to mention AI. I think AI obviously has lowered the barrier to entry. We've been saying that for a while, but I think it's getting to the point where it's a game changer. And what you're seeing is, from the 2000s, this idea of or the 2010s, a kind of cliched hacker operating alone. We then saw through the last 10 years organized crime groups, not just Russian-speaking, but Spanish-speaking in Latin America, for example, as well. Realizing they needed someone techie in their group, in their organized crime group. So bringing someone in. Great, you do your thing, enable us, we'll go with our chainsaws, for example, and extort an insider in a bank in Mexico or in Brazil, and we'll combine that with a technical aspect. So those are some of the types of attacks that we've managed are very much insider threat, extortions and kidnappings with a digital aspect to get devices into branches of financial institutions in South America, for example. Now, with AI, you're seeing that groups that have no technical capability, no real understanding, are able now to move into this space. So if you think about it, you've had the most entrepreneurial criminals for the last 10 years looking at cybercrime and wanting a piece of the pie. But that's probably only the top 15% of the most innovative criminals. The rest of them are now able to move into this space. That's why we're seeing such a surge in fraud. That's why we're going to continue to see this problem, I'm afraid, increase. Whether it's AI driving a volume surge, so being able to generate phishing emails rapidly, leveraging the data that's out there about all of us to improve the quality of those phishing emails, whether, as I said, it's the speed to entry because you're lowering the barrier to entry for criminals, and generally social engineering at scale. We're seeing criminals realize that companies have invested in defenses. They've got good detection, not all, but a lot of big companies. So the way in now is to go in through people, as always. So they're more sophisticated because they're using more advanced AI tooling, but they're kind of less sophisticated and going back to basics because increasingly they're just targeting employees, contractors, through social engineering to gain access. So why Spain? Before I get on to what we can do about it. Well, I think, unfortunately, there has been a lack of investment in defense in Spanish companies. As a market, it does tend to be more reactive than proactive. Also, we see quite a lot of outsourcing where, companies, rather than wanting to invest in long-term overheads will choose a SOC as a service, for example, or a CISO as a service, which can be a great solution to enable you to get going and build your cyber defense. But quite often those types of services aren't personalized, aren't specific, they're not going to understand your environment so well, and they're going to provide a lesser level of security. I've mentioned already the prevalence of PMAs and SMEs. You know, these companies struggle to have the funds to invest in cybersecurity. Now they're facing this tidal wave of regulation, DORA, NIS2, and it's a struggle. It's a struggle. We talk to companies all the time that really need to take a prioritized approach to these challenges and just tackle the top 5 burning items because they can't possibly deal with the whole list of things they need to become truly cyber secure. Geopolitical risk I've mentioned already, so Spain's role in the Ukraine war, for example, you know, brings attention and brings risk. Supply chain exposure. Lots of Spanish companies have a supply chain that extends outside Spain to, for example, Latin America, where there is more risk, there's generally lower level of defense, and there are criminals, very innovative criminals who are looking more and more at cyber and engaged in cybercrime and fraud. And the attack surface around language. So, you know, having worked in a major Spanish bank, we see attacks emanating from South America in Spanish, but also attacks in English and Russian. So that creates an extra large attack surface for Spain. So what can we do about it, and how do we address this asymmetric challenge? So, you know, I raised this really to highlight what I think companies need to do. And the FTI mission here is to try to bring quite a unique collection of expertise, practical expertise, and global reach to businesses of all sizes, so to help level the battlefield. So businesses have to adopt a comprehensive approach. You can't just, there's no point running a forensic investigation without considering the intelligence picture. There's no point doing a maturity assessment if you're not running regular annual pen tests. There's no point, you know, creating or reacting to an individual instance without thinking holistically about this issue. We're seeing an asymmetric threat where nation states or tooling created by nation states or organized crime groups enabled by nation states are able to target small and medium-sized companies. So our mission at FTI is to bring our expertise, our unique expertise, to those companies. We specifically have a mix of first-line practitioners with experience in cybersecurity on the front line. So the people that wrote the laws. So for example, we have people that wrote DORA. The people that implemented the laws. So for example, myself working in the National Cybercrime Unit and leading that. And the people working on the front line in corporates who deal with these problems day in, day out. So our people are a unique mix of practitioners from intel agencies, regulators, and corporates that have addressed cybersecurity through their whole career. We're in 34 countries. There's 450 of us in cybersecurity, 8,000 of us in the whole company. So we're able to manage these attacks, which so often are, almost always are international, and affect your supply chain in multiple countries. We can manage those across the piece. And we always apply that expertise comprehensively and holistically in the way that businesses also need to think. So we have what's called 360 response. So that includes one of the industry's best crisis communications teams for planning and delivering your crisis comms during a cyber incident. We did the crisis comms on Colonial Pipeline, on Equifax, for example, as well as the technical experts, the forensic experts, the data analysis experts, the ransomware negotiation and intelligence experts, and the readiness capacity. So for doing all of those prevention and readiness activities that you need. We can deliver a one-stop shop on cybersecurity, so you don't need 5 different retainers, 5 different incident response vendors. You can work with FTI to deliver all of that at once to help you level the battlefield. So we've got all of the typical certifications you'd expect, but then we've got leaders from the public sector who've, as I said, written the laws, implemented the laws. We've got that global reach in 34 countries, and then this holistic approach that delivers not just incident response, but crisis communications, the communications with the regulators where we've worked. We've got relationships with 100 of the 100 top law firms in the world, so we can manage that part, the litigation part for you as well. So some of the examples of some of the things we've done, Colonial Pipeline I mentioned, where we were able to plan the communications for them. Recently, I was involved in a nation-state-linked operation in the Middle East, involved in with a large American company for collecting forensics on site and providing that as part of an insider threat investigation. And then ransomware negotiation of a famous French retail brand where we were able to combine our intelligence capability with our forensics capability to inform the negotiation with the attacker. And this is a key part of what we do. It's putting in parallel the forensic investigation and the intelligence investigation. So we're not just going to do one action for you, right? Yeah, pay us to analyze this laptop. Y ya está. We're going to combine that with our presence in online forums in order to build a picture of what's happened to you faster. And then combine that with our expertise doing this frontline for corporates and our expertise and our relationships with the police, with governments, and with regulators. So you bring all those aspects together to deliver a better response when it comes to containment, when it comes to your negotiation strategy, when it comes to your communication strategy, which I know is, if number one on the agenda in the crisis committee is business impact, number two is comms plan. And that's what we have, a global leading cyber crisis comms practice. So finally, just to leave you with, from our perspective, some of the things which for a less mature organization and then a more mature organization, how do you confront this new paradigm in terms of nation-state sponsored threats? Foundational controls, obviously. You can't do everything. Put in place your initial controls, your MFA, your EDR, your documental playbook. That bit's obvious. I think the other bits are nicely summarized in making cyber everyone's job. So training and awareness. If I only had the budget to do two things, one of them would be training and awareness with employees who are your front line on cybersecurity. Know your regulatory landscape. Know what's required of you in this increasingly complex landscape that we operate. Invest in cyber insurance. It's a massively growing market. More and more people are taking that up. The second thing I'd do if I had the money after, making cyber everyone's job and doing the training would be getting a rapid response retainer so that when it happens, which it will, I'm able to deal with it rapidly with a company that understands my business. And then this communication plan point. If you're a more mature organization, and we work with both types, clearly this decade, it's all about operational resilience, having the resilience to deal with an attack, to continue your business even during an attack. I-led, intelligence-led defense. We see so many companies throw hundreds of millions, some of them hundreds of thousands at cybersecurity without a real sense of the metrics or where they're putting, where their biggest risk is. We have an I-led program which focuses on using Intel to identify your core risks, identify the TTPs related to that risk, the controls you need, and then present to the board in a clear way how your money, your investment, feeds through into reducing those specific risks. So you don't have that conversation with the board of, well, I've spent 100 grand, why am I still having problems? Advanced simulations and trainings. We run a lot of VIP protection, stress test simulations. Third-party supply chain risk management, fundamental to get on top of the challenge, the modern challenge where criminals are increasingly targeting the supply chain. Insider risk, as I mentioned, criminals targeting inside organizations to circumvent your controls, and of course intelligence sharing. If we're not sharing intel, we can't have any hope of dealing with this problem. And lastly, cyber's not just a risk, it's also an opportunity for businesses. It's an opportunity to enhance brand. It's an opportunity to deliver a transformation, a digital transformation in your business. This is an area where I think I've seen it from the inside. Banco Santander's done a great job of using cyber as a way to demonstrate that the business is modern and to actually drive transformation. The previous head of cybersecurity for Banco Santander is now the head of retail and commercial banking because he delivered a transformational change on how cyber was managed as a global digital team and is now transferring that to the rest of the business. So I'll leave it there. I'm Ollie Gower, as I said. We're FTI Consulting. We work with all sorts of businesses, and I think we have a unique offer in terms of our expertise, our frontline experience, our government relations, and I'm very happy to be here. So thank you very much.
Round of applause for Ollie. Thank you.